There you go. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. Excited about the turnout here in the summit. I'm Josh Olson. I'm with the Kansas Water Office. John gave you kind of the national take on what's going on with reservoir sedimentation, and I'm going to focus on Kansas specifically. So there are 24 reservoirs federal reservoirs in Kansas that were constructed between 1940 and 1982. 16 of those were built by the Corps of Engineers, 8 by the Bureau of Reclamation, and the state of Kansas owns or manages storage in 15 of the core reservoirs. Those reservoirs have a variety of authorized purposes and benefits: water supply, flood risk management, water quality, recreation, navigation, and fish and wildlife. So a lot of uses, lots of different angles why people enjoy the reservoirs and rely on them. The impetus really for creating these reservoirs originally was primarily to do with flood risk. This is a picture in 1951 of Topeka, and you can see the flooding from the Kansas River from that northeast Kansas flood. It killed 24 people and caused approximately $760 million of damage back in 1951. If you adjust that for inflation, that's about $9.6 billion in current damages. And so this was really sort of the trigger event to look at building these reservoirs for flood risk management. Tuttle specifically has prevented $12.4 billion in damages since it was constructed in 1962. But as I mentioned, there's a variety of benefits from these reservoirs, and as many of you in this room are aware and rely on, it also provides water supply. This is a diagram of the water supply customers in the Kansas River Basin, and you can see there's a variety of municipal and industrial users throughout that whole system, so Tuttle Creek Lake really a driving piece of infrastructure for that whole system, actually provides water supply and flood benefit to 40% of the population of the state. If you look, you have Manhattan, Topeka, Lawrence, and Kansas City. So very valuable piece of infrastructure. But let's talk about what happened when we built the reservoirs. So John touched on this a bit, sediment continuity, right? So before we built the reservoirs, we had flooding issues, but we had an undisturbed river. And so we had 5.3 million tons per year. The Big Blue River, that's what Tuttle is located on. The Big Blue River had 5.3 million tons per year of sediment coming in and 5.3 million tons of sediment per year going out. So everything coming in was going out. Then we built the dam, which provided us Tuttle Creek Lake. Tremendous benefits there, right? But also, we created a deeper water environment. We slowed down the energy, which meant that sediments that had been passing through that reach of the river are now actually depositing in Tuttle. And so as I mentioned, you essentially were passing all of it before. Now we're passing about 107,000 tons per year instead of that 5.3 million tons coming in. So about 98% of Tuttle sediment that comes in stays there and is deposited. So we've lost continuity, and we get the benefit of the reservoir, but we have sediment accumulating. So what does that look like over time? So this is just a diagram kind of showing from construction of a reservoir to filling up with sediment. And so initially, right, you build the dam, there isn't the sediment, it's just the original bed. Over time, you build up that delta, you have sediment depositing near the gate, and it fills up more and more. And eventually, and like you see in that bottom right corner, it fills up with enough sediment that you have very little pool left, and you've lost the majority of the benefit. Now, what I want to point out here is that we talk about the loss of sediment continuity. The system wants to get back to continuity, right? Like it wants to get back to equilibrium. So if we don't do anything, ultimately that reservoir will fill up with sediment, and eventually it will pass all the sediment coming in because we don't have an infinite amount of storage to use to house it. So the system will get back to equilibrium one way or another. It's just a matter of whether you do something to ensure that there's still some storage in the reservoir to benefit from, or if you just want to let it fill up and lose all that benefit. I do want to clarify, so throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about percent of remaining storage. This is a diagram of Tuttle's storage allocation. So on the bottom, you have that multi-purpose pool. That's when, talking about things like water supply, water quality, recreation, the multi-use benefits. And that's what I'm referring to when I talk about percent remaining storage. Up above that is actually the flood control, and that is a larger pool, which you can see some of the estimates for storage there. They're a little outdated. This is, I think, 15 years old. So like multi-purpose now is about 225,000 acre feet. But just want to clarify so that people aren't thinking that I'm saying we're almost out of flood control space in Tuttle. I'm specifically referring to the multi-purpose space. If we look at the reservoirs, those 15 that I mentioned that the Water Office owns storage or helps manage, you can see the annual sediment loads there. I'll point out specifically Tuttle, that 3,400 acre feet, or about 6 million cubic yards of sediment per year. To give you a visual for what that means, if you were to take a football field from the back of one end zone to the back of another end zone and sideline to sideline, and you were to stack that annual load of sediment, it would be roughly twice the height of the Empire State Building. And that's the average annual load to Tuttle. So you're talking about a ton of material. If you look at the entire system, all of those reservoirs, it's about 14 million cubic yards. So a tremendous amount of material coming in on a regular basis to all of those reservoirs, removing the storage or filling up the storage. And so if we look here, what does it mean effectively? Well, you can see that red bar, that's capacity lost to sediment. Blue bars are for remaining storage within the multi-purpose pool. We have refined this Tuttle Creek estimate a little bit, and so now our estimate is like 25% remaining by 2074, so a little better than this, but still it gives you the visual, if you look throughout the state, that there's a number of reservoirs that are significantly impacted. Tuttle, Perry has a lot, John Redmond, Fall River, Toronto, Elk City, Canopolis, a number of reservoirs that you can see over time eventually becoming more sediment than water supply storage. So it's maybe feels like a slow-moving issue, but over time it really has a big impact on those reservoirs. If we look at one basin specifically, the Kansas River Basin, this is a storage versus demand plot. You can see the colored bars are for storage of each reservoir. The black line is for low demand, so just some difference in forecasting future demands for water supply. That dashed red line would be a higher demand scenario, and essentially what they're looking at is ability to get through a drought like the 1950s. That's the drought of record that we use. And so essentially those crossover points that you see, we're losing storage, and you can really see Tuttle, the brown one, thinning over time. But where the crossover point occurs with the red and black lines, that's essentially saying that at that point, we would not be able to meet downstream demands through a 1950s style drought. And so you can see within the next 40 to 50 years, we're forecasting that we would have issues in a scenario like that. So we've talked about the impacts within the reservoir of all that sediment accumulating, but it's also having an impact downstream. The Corps did a study in 2016 looking at the sediment load on the Kansas River system before all of those reservoirs were built versus after all those reservoirs were built. And you'll note on that map, it's not just the main stem Kansas River, it's the whole Kansas River Basin. But the estimate was that before building those reservoirs and those dams, there was 44 million tons per year of sediment moving through the system. After installing those dams, creating those reservoirs, 13 million tons per year only coming through. So a 70% reduction in sediment transport. And as John mentioned, this has downstream impacts in terms of creating sediment-starved water and potentially enhancing erosion and land loss downstream from that, as well as you are changing essentially the downstream system. And so the species that have adapted to a more turbid environment do not do as well in that clear water. Again, 98% of the sediment removed in Tuttle, that significantly impacts what the water looks like downstream. So we have these reservoirs, they have great benefits, but they have a problem and they're creating impacts. What do we do? The first attempt at doing something in reservoir happened at John Redmond Reservoir. It has about 100,000 acre feet of multi-purpose storage, which includes a 3-foot pool raise in 1976 and a 2-foot pool raise in 2013. And its historical annual sedimentation rate is about 700 acre feet, or 1.2 million cubic yards of sediment, which has resulted since construction in losing about 44% of that multi-purpose pool. And it's a critical water supply source for the Neosho River, for public water suppliers and industrial users. And in particular, it supplies the cooling pond for the Wolf Creek Nuclear Power Plant, which produces more than 20% of the total energy production in Kansas. So an important resource. So as it's filling up with sediment, important resource, what do? In 2016, the state conducted a dredging project at John Redmond Reservoir. This was traditional dredging with off-site disposal. So you can see there pictures of the dredge, the cutter section head dredge, and it was Great Lakes Dredge and Dock that did the project, and we obviously did it in coordination with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as well. And so essentially what you're doing with that dredge, you're going down, you're disturbing the sediment, and then you're sucking it away via pipeline to an off-site disposal area. This is just sort of an overview of what that looked like. So you see the brown hatched area, that's where the dredge actually operated. The red line is the pipeline that took the material from the dredge to those confined disposal facilities, which you can see along the edge of John Redmond, sort of on that southeast corner. And the pipeline itself had more than 5.5, I believe, 5.5 miles of pipe to transport that material. So you're talking about an extensive transportation system for that sediment. Ultimately, the project was successful. It removed 3 million cubic yards of sediment at a cost of $20 million. And so if you take that at the cost per cubic yard in 2016, it was about $6.67, and roughly $3 of that was just for the sediment transport and disposal. So almost half of the total cost just went to that process of moving the sediment to the offsite disposal facilities and reclaiming that land, getting that land. If you were to take the $6.67 and look at the Corps' real costs of dredging or engineering, their tables, it makes it roughly $11 per cubic yard in 2025 costs, so a significant cost there. I will say, talking to people after the John Redmond dredging, when I told people that it was $6.67 per cubic yard, they felt like that was a pretty good price for traditional dredging with offsite disposal. So while it sounds expensive, I think, actually relative to what it was, we did pretty well. So this project, it was the first of its kind project in the nation with a non-federal entity dredging sediment from a core reservoir for the purpose of ensuring water supply storage. So it was really kind of groundbreaking in that sense. The Water Office was awarded a Department of the Army Certificate of Appreciation for work which resulted in the approval of the first and largest inland Section 408 request in the U.S. to be approved by the Corps headquarters. Sorry, kind of a long name for the award. So it was considered a success. It's really served as a foundation for future dredging efforts in Kansas. But again, almost half the cost went to that transport and disposal of the sediment. So it demonstrated the relatively high cost of having to do that aspect of the traditional dredging approach, which then brought us to the question, is there a more cost-effective way of doing this? So as John talked about, what comes through the system downstream of the reservoir not really matching what's upstream? Well, what if we were able to get the system to something more natural? What if we could pass what was coming into the system? As John mentioned, currently downstream from the dam at 2,000 CFS, which is what this graph shows, you have about 20 milligrams per liter, whereas regular conditions are 200 to 5,000 milligrams per liter. So again, just a reminder of the jelly bean analogy. We're currently releasing a 50th of a jelly bean in a liter of water. What if we could make it a fifth to 5 jelly beans? And instead of having to do offsite disposal, we could do sediment bypass. So pursuing that idea, one technology that was identified as a potential fit for doing that was water injection dredging. Water injection dredging uses a jet bar injecting high volumes of water at low pressure to resuspend the sediment at the reservoir bed and create a density current. And so this is just kind of a figure showing the process. Essentially, you're injecting into the bed, create that density current. That density current then flows based on differences in density between the overlying water column and the more sediment-laden density current itself. And also, if you have some gravity, that helps as well if there's a gravity difference or a height difference. See if it'll play this. There we go. So this is actually at the Engineering Research and Development Center in Vicksburg, Mississippi, that the Corps has. This is actually Tuttle sediment. So this is Kansas sediment putting on a show for you at a flume that they did there. And you can see there they're creating that density current. They're injecting water into the sediment. You can see it moving underneath the overlying water column. And I'll point out too, actually, this specific flume doesn't actually have any slant. So it was moving like this on a flat surface, just purely based on the energy of the injection and the density differences. So gives you a good idea of what that looks like. It tends to stay more along the bottom. It's not really just like mixing with the overlying water column, and it tends to stay together, and you see that bottom layer. The idea was that you could do this at a reservoir, and then if you had a low-level outlet, you could just vent that density current during normal operations. Tuttle Creek Lake was identified as a potential fit for this. Tuttle is approximately 50% full of sediment, which is actually on par with what they were expecting when they built these reservoirs. So I think it's important to point out this isn't an unexpected problem. We knew this was going to happen when the reservoirs were built, but solving that issue has been a more recent development, but it's not an unexpected issue that we're dealing with. To get ready for potentially doing with, there was a sediment analyzed, and it was determined to be of the right physical characteristics to be fluidizable, and it was sufficiently uncontaminated. And Tuttle also has a low-level outlet at the bottom of the reservoir that you could use for passing that density current. So Tuttle ultimately we pursued using with there. That's why we're here, the Tuttle Creek Lake Water Injection Dredging Demonstration, which is ongoing. And I won't get into that anymore because Michael's going to talk about that next. We have also been pursuing a hydrosuction demonstration at John Redmond Reservoir. I have a video there. I don't know if I can click it. Are you able to click it from the back? A verification error. Oh, there it is.
Sediment is the...
We'll just give it a second. So we've been pursuing hydrosuction. We actually have been working with a company called Sedicon out of Norway a little bit. They did a preliminary cost estimate, and this provides some background information actually from a project they have in Guatemala.
Mud, the sand, and the gravel that is naturally transported by a river. However, we built dams on many of the major rivers in the United States, and when you build a dam, it causes that flowing sediment to stop flowing. John Redmond has a tremendous sediment problem. Every year, 1.2 million cubic yards of sediment accumulate in the lake, and that's year after year forever. The most cost-effective and all-around best way to manage sediment is to pass it downstream. If you can pass it downstream at the same rate that it's coming into the lake, you are restoring a natural sediment regime to the river. With traditional dredging, you have to add a lot of energy to the system, usually with diesel pumps or electric pumps, to pump that sediment slurry, and you put it in a disposal facility on the land somewhere. Hydrosuction is essentially a siphon, but rather than siphoning gas, you're siphoning muddy water. Hydrosuction has been implemented in several different countries and different lakes of varying sizes. One of these lakes is El Canada Lake in Guatemala. There are several components to the hydrosuction sediment removal system. There's a raft that can move around from place to place in the lake, kind of like a vacuum cleaner at the bottom of a swimming pool. There are water jets to stir up the sediment, and then there's a suction pipeline to suck up that sort of sediment slurry. And then there's the pipeline itself, which it connects to an existing conduit in the dam, and it discharges downstream.
Hydrosuction has the benefit that it's a very low cost and low maintenance equipment. They have been dredging every day since 2011, and they have managed to lower the sediment volume and basically have the plant operating completely well.
The same sort of system that was implemented at El Canada could be implemented at John Redmond Lake. There is a 30-inch unused water line that is just sitting there right now, waiting for someone to hook up a pipe to it that could suck sediment, from the lake and discharge it downstream.
Yeah, so again, we have the WID demonstration ongoing. Next demonstration we're pursuing is that hydrosuction demonstration as another means of passing sediment downstream. As was mentioned in that video, John Redmond is an ideal fit both based on need of maintaining that pool, but also having that 30-inch outlet or pipe going through the dam, which is only really used for passing sediment downstream during maintenance operations, so minimal use, and it seems like an ideal fit, so we're continuing to pursue that. We've been talking about potentially doing a multi-year demonstration there. So overall, where does that leave us with sediment management in Kansas? Well, we have the WID demonstration. We're pursuing the John Redmond hydrosuction demonstration. And then after that, those will provide really important pieces of information in terms of how to approach sediment management effectively in Kansas. After that, we're working through the process with the Corps of exactly how we need to proceed, but looking at potentially major rehabilitation or feasibility studies to essentially define what the ideal path is or plan would be for long-term management of sediment at various reservoirs. We've sort of tentatively identified 6 reservoirs throughout the state, 3 in the Kansas City district and 3 within the Tulsa district, so Tuttle, Kannapolis, and Perry in Kansas City district, John Redmond, Council Grove, and Elk City in the Tulsa district, that we've been essentially pursuing, trying to move those 6 forward, collecting data, and trying to get to long-term management, sediment management at them. I will say the major rehab or feasibility studies are typically about 3 years, so just to set expectations in terms of how long it would take to get from where we are to long-term implementation. There is a bit of additional work to do. That would be followed by probably a design and construction phase, and then hopefully long-term implementation. So we're really kind of defining the path as we go. I think Kansas is certainly unique in terms of what we've been trying to accomplish for reservoir sediment management. And so that's been part of the struggle at times, is if the path isn't defined, what is the path? And so we really have had to kind of craft it as we go. I can tell you that there are people all over the country that are paying attention to the WID demonstration and very curious to see what happens, and even actually people that I've talked to around the world that are curious to see what happens. So really important projects, not just for Kansas, but really for the overall reservoir sediment management conversation. Some other topics that I'll throw out there, and won't go into great detail, but if you want to talk about it with me some other time during the summit, I'm happy to. Wanting to think about other sediment management technologies, obviously we brought up WID and hydrosuction, but there are other technologies that could be considered. Dredging with downstream discharge, so essentially using the same dredge that we did at John Redmond, but just passing the sediment downstream instead of going to an off-site disposal facility. The thought is that would require more energy to operate the dredge than something like WID or hydrosuction. But there's pros and cons really to every technology. You could also do a drawdown flush to pass sediment, and if you draw down a reservoir, it allows you to pass a significant amount of sediment. But again, pros and cons for each of those. And then a few sort of core specific pieces of this in terms of big picture, trying to advocate for reservoir sediment management. There's been discussion about getting water supply as a core primary mission area. As I said, those reservoirs really started out as flood risk management projects. And so water supply hasn't necessarily always been viewed as equal to some of the other authorized uses. There was some momentum for this in the 2024 WRDA. There was language that made it into the preliminary cut and then ultimately didn't make the final cut. Some other things to consider: if the downstream discharge of sediment is a beneficial use, so as I mentioned, impacts from not having that sediment in the downstream system. if you were to classify restoring sort of the natural system to, or the natural turbidity levels to the downstream channel as a beneficial use, that would put it in a significantly different category with the Corps. There was a 2023 beneficial use of dredge material command philosophy notice, and that goal was essentially to get to 70% beneficial use by 2030. Sort of in line with that, the Chief of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board, they made a recommendation in 2020 essentially recommending that the downstream channel system and receiving coastal systems be considered beneficial use. So that would be in line with this recommendation as well. So there's some support for that as well. And then prioritizing sediment continuity and a system-based approach to solve these issues. If we say that a reservoir that has another dam downstream can't manage its sediment, then we're dooming a lot of reservoirs. And so it basically requires that you think about it as a system and passing sediment consistently through to try to restore sediment continuity all the way through the system. And this was another thing that the Environmental Advisory Board did actually recommend. That long-term ecosystem health and sustainability of reservoir project benefits could be improved by reestablishing sediment continuity through rivers and the whole riverine system. So some additional pieces here that could be helpful in really laying the foundation for sediment management in Kansas, but really reservoirs throughout the country. So with that, I will just ask if there's any questions. Yeah, so what I would say with the John Redmond piece, so it would be a different approach, obviously, than the dredging out at the reservoir, since we would be passing it downstream. Working with KDHE, we're looking largely at, if there's any contamination of concern. Downstream impacts and what that looks like for public water suppliers, obviously, we're very, very interested in that and want that to be part of the consideration as well. There are tests like a Lutriate test, which we did for Tuttle, and we'll have that data for John Redmond as well, which is essentially you take sediment from the reservoir and water from the reservoir and you stir it up so that you can see what it would look like basically to stir up that sediment and pass it downstream, what kind of impacts we'd expect. And so you look at that site water before it interacted with the sediment and then after it interacted with the sediment, which would help give some idea for public water suppliers, what that might ultimately look like. So it would certainly be part of the consideration. There's a lot of background work still to be done on John Redmond. I will say, though, the alternative being that the sediment fills up the reservoir and then we don't have water supply, we hope that there's maybe a bit of an open mind to solving the problem together so that we have water to treat, right? So, but absolutely there are potential impacts from passing more sediment, and would want to talk about those with the public water supply community. I will also say, while sediment can change somewhat from when it enters a reservoir to when it leaves, because it's depositing and it's sitting there for some time, that can have water quality impacts or water chemistry implications. Ultimately, this material all came from the watershed, right? So if that dam hadn't been there, it would have just kept going through. So we're not really adding anything foreign per se, though obviously things can happen during the deposition and time in the reservoir. But yeah, so appreciate the question. Yeah. Yeah, so there weren't any treatment triggers from the fall period and I don't know how much Michael's going to get into this, but the spring period, there was a little bit more of an impact observed, but it was, we need to do some work teasing out exactly what was WID versus a significant runoff event that occurred at about the same time. And so they did notice some more significant impacts in the spring, but it would be hard to say definitively exactly how much was from WID versus a natural event that happened. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and I can't comment on that until all the dredging is done. So that'll be something that the Corps is working out. But obviously, a piece of the demonstration that we're very keen on, getting that information and having that as a comparison for both the John Redmond dredging, but also other potential sediment management initiatives. But that'll be something that will certainly be included in the analysis. But we're not really releasing that information until the analysis is. Until we have all 3 dredging periods done and get into the analysis after that. Yep, but great question. Yep. Yeah, I mean, the long-term goal is to have enough water supply, right? Like, it's pretty simple. You know, you could bring up conversations like building another reservoir for additional supply, or people talk about things like reuse, and all of those topics are legitimate. I will say it's really hard to replace the amount of water that is stored in a reservoir, and they're really expensive to build. So I think, you know, the target is essentially just meeting the demands for the decades into the future, and that could be different approaches to do that. But I think what you find when you dig into it is that those reservoirs are just pretty key to doing it in the most cost-effective way possible. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the bubbler question, I mean, I have heard conversations about like using some sort of jet or aeration to keep sediment from depositing or maintaining like fixed areas of a reservoir. I haven't seen a proposal or cost estimate that necessarily made me think that idea would move forward, but I've heard discussion of it. And then in terms of the pipe itself, one thing that we have going for us in the sediment that we're managing is that it's really fine material. So it's part of why WID works. It needs to be fine material. And John Redmond is mostly fine material too. And so the damage that John showed in that turbine was really caused by sand and coarser material. So you know, we get the benefit of not having really the most eroding material coming through, but you would certainly want to keep an eye on it. And as you move farther and farther up a reservoir, technically there would be more and more sand in the fraction. But we are mostly looking at silts and clays in what we've been managing. All right, thank you.